The first reports reached the outer colonies in fragments, carried by damaged relays and frightened civilian traffic controllers who had never heard their channels filled with such cold, measured alien voices before, voices that spoke perfect trade language and yet carried a tone of absolute certainty that humanity, as a young and scattered species, would submit without resistance. And in the command halls of Earth and Mars, the same message was replayed again and again as admirals, diplomats, and analysts listened in silence to the declaration issued by the Karthul coalition, a dominant regional power whose fleets had crushed 3 neighboring civilizations in less than a decade. The message stated that Terran space lay within newly claimed security zones, that human expansion had been judged inefficient and disorderly, and that for the sake of galactic stability, Earth would accept restricted sovereignty under Karthul's supervision. The statement ended with what their translators identified as a phrase of formal dismissal, one usually reserved for minor client species, and in the quiet that followed, Vice Admiral Richard Hale, a man with 30 years of service and a voice worn down by command, finally said that they had just been called weak in the most polite way possible. Across the ocean on the blue world below, news networks interrupted regular programming to show the alien symbol of the coalition, a many-layered spiral of metal and light, and anchors struggled to explain to billions of viewers that an empire most had never heard and now claimed authority over humanity's future. In the halls of the United Nations, Ambassador Laura Bennett listened as representatives argued about whether the message was real, whether it was a bluff, or whether it was simply another distant threat that would fade with time. But the military briefings were clear. The Karthul fleets were real, their past conquests were documented, and their nearest task force was already moving toward the Sol perimeter at a steady, confident pace, as if they expected no resistance worth calculating. On the bridge of the exploration cruiser Horizon, Captain Daniel Cross watched long-range sensors paint faint, but growing signatures beyond the Kuiper Belt, and he felt a calm settle over him that he had only known before battle, because the numbers did not lie. The approaching formation was larger than any human fleet ever assembled in one place, and yet their formation was loose, almost careless, a posture of a force that believed itself untouchable. In the Karthul flagship, a vast structure of interlocking armored segments and glowing command spires, Supreme Strategist Vael'kor reviewed the data on humanity with what his kind considered professional thoroughness. The humans were technologically competent but inexperienced, numerous but politically divided. Their warships were built for defense and patrol, rather than for rapid, decisive annihilation, and their history showed internal conflicts far more often than unified external wars. To Vael'kor, this pattern meant a species still learning how to survive, not one ready to challenge a power that had refined warfare across centuries. He addressed the ruling council through a secure channel and stated that the Terrans would comply once they understood the imbalance of force. Resistance would be brief, symbolic, and useful only as a lesson to other developing civilizations. On Earth, President Andrew Collins was informed of this assessment by his intelligence chief, who explained that intercepted Karthul communications showed no expectation of serious combat. They spoke of the coming operation as a demonstration, not a campaign. And in that word, the human leadership heard both arrogance and opportunity, because a demonstration could be turned into a disaster for those who believed they were the only ones capable of teaching lessons. In a secure room beneath the Rocky Mountains, senior commanders gathered around a holographic display of the solar system, and General Karen Holt, whose career had been built on logistics rather than speeches, pointed out that the enemy's confidence was creating predictable patterns. Their approach routes, their supply lines, and their command structure were all visible in ways that only an overconfident force would allow. She said that the Karthul were treating space as if it were a parade ground rather than a battlefield, and that humans had learned long ago that wars were not won by parades. They were won by preparation, deception, and the ability to strike where the enemy least expected. In the same moment, far beyond human space, a young Karthul tactical officer named Sirathal observed the same sensor data and felt a faint, unfamiliar unease. The Terran ships were not clustering in a defensive ring as predicted. Instead, they were dispersing, slipping into positions that did not match standard doctrine. When Sirathal reported this to her superior, she was told that the humans were simply disorganized, that their lack of unified formation proved their weakness, and that once the coalition fleet arrived in full strength, the scattered Terran forces would either withdraw or be destroyed in detail. The officer accepted the answer, yet the unease remained. because the movements she saw were not random. They were deliberate, precise, and timed on Mars, in the shipyards that orbited the Red Planet. Engineers worked without pause as reserve vessels were brought out of storage, their hulls scarred from old conflicts, their systems updated with quiet efficiency, and the workers said little, but the tension in their movement spoke of a shared understanding that history was approaching. In a research facility on Luna, scientists monitored the readiness of experimental systems that had never before been deployed in combat. Technologies born from decades of cautious development, held back by treaties and budgets, now authorized for use because the situation had passed beyond politics and into survival. In the Karthul command sphere, Vael'kor addresses admirals and repeated his assessment that humanity lacked the will and unity for prolonged resistance. He stated that a single overwhelming display of force near their home world would be enough to secure compliance, and that the rest of the galaxy would take note of the efficiency with which the coalition brought order to a minor, unruly region. The admirals signaled agreement. Their species valued consensus, and dissent was rare when the strategist spoke with such certainty. Yet even as they planned their demonstration, human commanders were planning something very different. Not a defense, not a negotiation, but a test of whether the lessons learned from centuries of war on one small world could be applied on a scale that now stretched across stars. And in the quiet moments between briefings, some of them remembered the words of old military theorists who had written that the most dangerous enemy was the one who believed the battle already won. And as the Karthul fleet closed in, carrying its banners of conquest and its confidence in the weakness of those approached, humanity prepared to show them that what they called weakness was in truth restraint, and that restraint, once abandoned, could reveal a way of what the galaxy had never been forced to face before. And as the Karthul advanced elements crossed the outer marker buoys that humanity had deliberately left broadcasting, their sensors detected only routine traffic and the faint emissions of distant mining platforms, nothing that suggested a prepared battlefield, which further confirmed Vael'kor's belief that the Terrans were still in the early stages of panic and political debate, unaware of how quickly a decisive force could end such uncertainty. Yet within the hidden layers of human space, a different reality unfolded, one in which long-dormant command protocols activated across fleets and installations, linking Earth, Mars, Luna, and the scattered colony worlds into a single operational network that bypassed normal bureaucratic channels and placed authority directly in the hands of experienced commanders, among them Admiral Susan Carter, a veteran of asymmetric conflicts and joint operations, who now coordinated the silent redeployment of task groups through micro-jump corridors that had been mapped but never publicly acknowledged, corridors that allowed ships to move along unexpected vectors and arrive in positions the Karthul had not even considered in their strategic models. On the bridge of the battleship Resolute, Captain Aaron Mitchell watched as his crew executed these maneuvers with disciplined calm, each officer aware that the approaching enemy outnumbered them in raw tonnage and firepower, yet also aware that raw numbers had rarely been a deciding factor in the wars humanity had survived. Mitchell recalled his training, the emphasis on initiative, on decentralized command, on the expectation that every unit might at any moment have to act without orders, and he understood that this philosophy, born from the chaos of human history, was about to be tested against an empire that valued rigid hierarchy and carefully scripted operations. In the Karthul fleet, the first reconnaissance probes were launched toward the inner system, their sensors sweeping for mass defenses or minefields, and they reported only scattered contacts and normal background activity, no dense formations, no obvious traps. And the data was relayed to Vael'kor, who interpreted it as further proof that the Terrans had not prepared a serious military response. He authorized the main body to continue its steady advance, maintaining parade formation to display the full scale of coalition power, believing that the visual impact alone would break any remaining human resolve. But within the Terran command network, that very formation was being studied, its patterns, its communication relays, its defensive envelopes, and its vulnerabilities, and analysts identified the key nodes whose disruption could cascade through the entire structure, nodes protected by formidable armor and energy fields, yet dependent on coordination and timing that assumed no interference beyond what their own doctrines anticipated. On Earth, in a secure operations center, Dr. Helen Brooks, a specialist in electronic warfare, briefed the Joint Chiefs on the Karthul command frequencies and data protocols that had been partially deciphered from earlier encounters with client species. She explained that while the Coalition's technology was advanced, its reliance on centralized control created points of fragility, and that carefully timed interference could introduce delays and contradictions into their decision cycles, forcing their admirals to operate with incomplete or outdated information, something their culture was not accustomed to handling. The plan that emerged was not one of direct confrontation, but of layered pressure, a combination of stealth, deception, electronic disruption, and sudden concentrated strikes, designed to create confusion and fear before the enemy could even understand that a battle had truly begun in the Karthul tactical sections. Sirathal continued to monitor the Terran movements, noting the absence of the expected defensive cordon around, the inner planets and the strange pattern of energy fluctuations that appeared and vanished near the heliopause. When she again raised her concerns, her superior reminded her that the humans had no record of fighting a peer adversary, that their scattered actions were more likely the result of indecision than a strategy, and that the Coalition's arrival in full strength would render any such movements irrelevant. Yet Sirathal could not ignore the sense that the Terrans were shaping the battle space in ways that did not fit the Coalition's models. On the far side of the system, a small human strike group under Commander Jason Reed, a man chosen precisely because he had no famous name and no political backing, positioned itself along a vector that intersected the Karthul supply train, a series of heavily protected but predictable logistics vessels that sustained the main fleet's advance. Reed's orders were simple: observe, wait, and strike only when the timing would produce maximum disruption rather than immediate destruction. He understood that the goal was not to win a single skirmish, but to begin unraveling the enemy's sense of control, to make them question their assumptions about the environment and the opponent, and as his ships powered down to minimum emissions, becoming little more than cold shadows against the cosmic background. He reflected that humanity's long history of fighting stronger foes had taught it patience, the ability to endure the tension of waiting for a precise moment when a small action could have disproportionate effect. In the Coalition flagship, Vael'kor finalized the schedule for the formal approach to Earth orbit, planning a broadcast that would accompany the fleet's arrival, a declaration of terms and a demonstration of overwhelming force, intended to be seen by the entire human population. He expected fear, outrage, and ultimately submission, the predictable sequence observed in so many other civilizations, and he took satisfaction in the efficiency of this process, believing that order, once imposed, would benefit even those who initially resisted it, unaware that the very predictability of his plan was being used against him. For in the human command centers, the timing of that broadcast was being treated as a countdown, a fixed point around which a series of actions would be synchronized, actions that would begin not with a visible exchange of fire, but with subtle shifts in invisible domains of communication, navigation, and perception, domains in which humans had learned to fight as fiercely as in the realm of guns and missiles. And as the minutes and hours passed, the distance between the two civilizations closed, not just in space, but in destiny, with one side confident in its superiority, and the other quietly preparing to reveal that what the galaxy had labeled as weakness was in fact a different kind of strength, one forged in countless conflicts, refined through adaptation, and now ready to be unleashed on a scale that would force even the most powerful empires to reconsider what it meant to challenge a species that had learned to survive by never underestimating its enemy. And as the final hours of the approach drew near, human intelligence operatives working across orbital platforms and deep space listening posts transmitted encrypted signals into the dark between the stars, subtle shifts in frequency, phase, and modulation designed to confuse and mislead the Coalition's long-range sensors. The Karthul officers interpreted these anomalies as random cosmic interference or minor technical glitches, their confidence in the supposed weakness of humanity preventing them from considering deception on such a scale. Meanwhile on Earth, Admiral Susan Carter convened a quiet council of fleet captains, scientists, and cyber warfare specialists in a subterranean command center beneath the Andes, the room lit only by the cold glow of holographic displays projecting the positions of thousands of human and alien ships. And she outlined the plan, a sequence of interlocking operations that depended on precise timing, coordinated patience, and the exploitation of enemy expectations, each element designed to amplify the psychological effect of every strike. The first wave would not even be directed at combat vessels, but at the auxiliary systems, the logistics chains, the communications nodes, the points of coordination that held the Coalition fleet together. By the time any of the Karthul realized the scope of the attacks, the humans would have already rearranged the battlefield to their advantage. In the Karthul command sphere, Vael'kor reviewed the data from the outermost pickets, noting the apparent lack of defensive concentrations, and again assured himself that the Terrans had no coherent strategy. The coalition fleet maintained a leisurely pace, formations stretching across millions of kilometers, symbols of power intended to cow any opposition. Yet at that very moment, across the solar system, human strike groups moved into positions calculated to strike multiple nodes simultaneously, small vessels slipping into gaps between patrols, automated drones beginning silent sweeps to disrupt sensor patterns, and the first signals of electronic interference began to ripple outward, subtle but disorienting delays in communications appearing as minor anomalies, enough to produce confusion when replicated across the fleet's command structure on Mars. Engineers ran final checks on experimental systems that had never left test environments, deploying devices that could create temporary field distortions in the Karthul energy shielding. While naval officers calculated precise windows of attack, microseconds of advantage that will allow human missiles to penetrate armor far stronger than any had previously breached. On Luna, Dr. Helen Brooks monitored the complex network of cybernetic infiltration programs designed to appear as harmless anomalies in Karthul software, but which would, at the right moment, seize control of targeting arrays, misroute defensive drones, and force adversary ships into unintended maneuvers, all planned with the knowledge that the enemy's confidence would make them slow to detect or respond to such interference, far beyond human-controlled space. Sirathal noticed irregularities in the sensor feeds that she could not account for, micro shifts in apparent positions of Terran vessels, fluctuations in background radiation that made tactical readings inconsistent. She reported these anomalies, yet her superiors dismissed them as technical glitches, believing the humans lacked the capability to manipulate data on such a sophisticated level. Yet as the Karthul ships continued their approach, their very formation became a liability, each small anomaly in timing or sensor data introducing cascading uncertainties into their calculations. The human command anticipated these delays and planned strikes to exploit them, each engagement designed not only to inflict damage, but to create a psychological effect that magnified the perception of human power in orbital shipyards. Around Earth, crews prepared missile batteries, railguns, and experimental energy weapons, their targeting systems aligned with the invisible current of influence flowing through space, while terrestrial systems tested synchronized detonations in the atmosphere and ionosphere to confuse and blind the incoming fleet's observational instruments. At the same time, Commander Jason Reed's strike group, hidden along a vector predicted to intersect the Karthul supply chain, waited in near silence, their engines in standby, emissions minimized, their crews running simulations of the timing sequences down to microsecond precision, aware that a single miscalculation could undo months of preparation. On the Karthul flagship, Vael'kor ordered the main fleet to maintain pace, to display unity, and to present the image of overwhelming control power, unaware that each maneuver, each slow adjustment of formation, was being recorded by human observers who would use those same predictable movements to strike with devastating precision. On the ground, civilians watched the skies with little understanding of the immense conflict looming above them. News broadcasts described the approaching fleet in clinical terms, fleets larger than Earth had ever seen. Speculation about diplomacy, possible conflict, and the unknown capabilities of humanity filled discussion panels, yet most were unaware that behind closed doors, the human military was about to turn the coalition's assumptions upside down, that what the galaxy considered a minor and primitive species had prepared an orchestration of warfare so intricate and ruthless that its first visible act would leave the supposedly dominant power reeling. And as the moments ticked down, the calm within human command centers was not fear, but focused anticipation, a collective understanding that the first engagement, though carefully controlled, would mark the end of illusion and the beginning of the terrifying revelation that humanity was never weak, that the species dismissed as incapable of standing against a galactic empire had in fact studied, prepared, and adapted to ensure that when the coalition finally believed victory assured, it would find itself facing a force that would challenge every expectation, invert every assumption, and deliver consequences far beyond what the Karthul had ever imagined possible. As the first signals of electronic interference began to propagate through the outermost nodes of the Coalition fleet, subtle enough to appear as ordinary cosmic anomalies, yet precisely timed to create hesitation, misalignment, and confusion, Captain Aaron Mitchell reflected on how human history had repeatedly turned disadvantage into advantage, and he understood that the same principles were now being applied on a scale that stretched across millions of kilometers of space, that the very arrogance of the Karthul, their certainty of superiority, was a tool humanity would use to turn a parade of dominance into a tableau of chaos. And in that silent, tense countdown, as fleets closed, sensors flickered, and minds on both sides raced to interpret what they saw, the galaxy held its breath, unaware that a single species, long underestimated, was about to rewrite the rules of engagement in a conflict that would be remembered for millennia, and that the term weakness would soon become the cruelest irony imaginable, as humanity prepared to reveal the terrifying truth about Terran warfare. And as the Karthul fleet crossed into the inner system, their sensors picked up anomalous readings that they still could not interpret correctly, patterns of motion that seemed inconsistent with any known Terran tactics, slight variations in velocity, minute changes in energy signatures, and electromagnetic fluctuations that suggested both presence and absence at the same time. Yet, Vael'kor dismissed these signals as random or inconsequential, confident that the humans could not possibly coordinate anything meaningful at this scale. Meanwhile, human commanders across orbital and interplanetary platforms synchronized their watches to a single temporal reference, a universal pulse emitted from the Lagrange relay network. And at the designated instant, a cascade of coordinated actions unfolded like clockwork. The first wave struck the auxiliary systems of the Coalition fleet with precision. Small missiles and drones creating disruptions in fuel conduits, power distribution lines, and communication hubs. Interference pulses generated from hidden satellites caused sensor rays to report false positions, leading ships to adjust course unnecessarily, while automated hacking sequences began to infiltrate targeting systems, redirecting defense protocols to empty sectors, creating confusion in the enemy ranks. On the Resolute, Captain Aaron Mitchell monitored the impact in real time, noting how each minor disruption amplified the next. The Karthul fleet began to exhibit hesitation, gaps opening in formations that had been considered impenetrable, and the human forces did not strike recklessly, but exploited every imperfection with disciplined timing. Commander Jason Reed's strike group emerged from stealth along the supply vector, unleashing a rapid volley of torpedoes and railgun shots that disabled key logistic vessels. The chain reaction spread as support craft were forced to maneuver unpredictably, collisions avoided by skillful piloting but causing delays that propagated through the fleet. Dr. Helen Brooks' cybernetic programs infiltrated targeting arrays, causing several of the Karthul warships to misinterpret friendly vessels as threats, firing upon each other in moments of brief chaos, creating a psychological shockwave among the Coalition's officers who were unused to any semblance of internal disorder on Mars. Experimental energy weapon projected synchronized pulses across key choke points, invisible to the eye yet devastating to shield. Harmonics, destabilizing fields and forcing the Karthul vessels to compensate in ways that reduced their offensive capability. In the Karthul flagship, Vael'kor's calm composure faltered as reports of system failures. Friendly fire and disrupted communications reached his console. He called for explanations, believing perhaps a single technician's error could be causing the anomalies, but the reports came from multiple sectors, multiple ships, and no single point of failure could account for. The scale, Sirathal, observing the battle in real time, could no longer dismiss the humans as primitive. Her unease deepened as she noted the deliberate coordination behind every strike, the subtle manipulation of perception, and the strategic patience displayed by Terran forces. It became clear to her that they were not acting randomly, but with a unified intelligence that exploited every weakness the Coalition had assumed was irrelevant. Across the inner planets, human fleets emerged from hidden vectors, presenting multiple axes of attack that forced Karthul ships to split their focus. Defensive shields realigned repeatedly, energy diverted in ways that diminished overall offensive potential. The psychological effect compounded as officers began questioning the accuracy of their sensors and the reliability of their communications. Civilian observers on Earth watched the first images transmitted through secure channels, seeing flashes of light and distant explosions, and while They did not understand the full scale. They sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding, that the humans they had always known were now demonstrating capabilities beyond their imagination. The Karthul, who had expected immediate submission, were confronted with the first revelation that the species they had dismissed as weak possessed a level of tactical brilliance and coordinated execution that no previous opponent had displayed. In the command halls beneath Earth, Admiral Carter and her staff monitored the unfolding disruptions, noting how each strike magnified the effects of the next, a domino confusion cascading to the coalition fleet. While Vice Admiral Hale coordinated reserve movements to cover critical human positions, ready to exploit openings created by the interference. As hours passed, the coalition fleet's forward elements were effectively neutralized or misdirected. Vael'kor's planned demonstration of dominance had become a scene of operational chaos. His carefully timed broadcast delayed, his sense of control slipping as human ingenuity reshaped the battlefield in ways he had never predicted. Commander Reed's group moved again, targeting additional support nodes, each strike calculated to maximize disorientation, and the coalition admirals began issuing conflicting orders, some attempting to regroup, others reacting to false threats, and the lack of a coherent response compounded the initial disruptions. Deep within the Karthul flagship, Vael'kor finally realized that this was not a minor anomaly, that the Terrans were exploiting the very structure and psychology of his fleet, and that what had been dismissed as weakness was in fact a terrifying combination of patience, coordination, and cunning. The first signs of panic rippled to the upper echelons of the coalition. Officers who had once regarded humans as inferior now faced evidence that every assumption they had made was flawed, that the species they had mocked and dismissed was executing a war of such sophistication and precision that the word weak no longer applied. On Luna, Dr. Brooks initiated the next phase, releasing programs that temporarily disabled several Karthul sensor networks, further isolating segments of fleet. Human gunnery crews and tactical operators adjusted their targets in real time, taking advantage of gaps in coverage to neutralize heavy weapons platforms, and across Mars and Earth orbit, additional units moved into pre-designated firing positions, all synchronized with a temporal pulse that ensured absolute coordination despite distance. And as the human operations continued with flawless execution, the first psychological fractures appeared in the Karthul command structure, uncertainty, hesitation, and mistrust spreading among officers who had never known doubt, the initial arrogance evaporating, replaced by the first taste of fear, the galaxy's presumed dominant power confronting the stark reality that humanity had studied, prepared, and executed a level of warfare they could not have imagined. And as the outermost Karthul vessels began to experience the cascading effects of disruption, misfires, and miscommunication, the full extent of the Terran plan began to reveal itself, a complex orchestration that turned every advantage the coalition had counted on into a liability. And in that moment, the Terrans finally began to expose their true power, a terrifying truth about Terran warfare that would echo across star systems, rewriting assumptions, and marking the first decisive blow in a conflict that the galaxy had not yet understood. And as the chaos spread to the coalition fleet, human forces escalated the second phase of their operation, one that would exploit the confusion already sown and amplify it into strategic paralysis. Small Terran strike groups deployed along vectors carefully calculated to intersect with key command nodes, energy relays, and logistical hubs, their approach masked by the residual interference from the first wave. And when they struck, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Targeting beams and precision missiles disabled communication satellites, corrupted navigation arrays, and disrupted the flow of fuel and energy to the Karthul warships, forcing captains to make rapid, high-risk adjustments, many of which compounded errors, leading to collisions, near misses, and inefficient maneuvering that further fragmented the fleet aboard the Resolute. Captain Mitchell observed the unfolding disaster with grim satisfaction, noting how each unit's actions were magnified by the enemy's. Reliance on predictable coordination, the human crews moved with disciplined precision. Every decision synchronized to exploit these disruptions, and yet flexible enough to adapt when unexpected reactions occurred. On Mars, the orbital yards launched a secondary wave of drones designed to create false targets, decoys that emitted the signatures of capital ships, drawing fire and sensor focus away from the true Terran vessels, while automated electronic warfare units injected contradictory data into the Karthul tactical feeds, further eroding their situational awareness. Commander Jason Reed's strike group executed a series of feints, appearing in one sector only to vanish and reappear elsewhere, creating the impression of greater numbers and forcing the coalition to redeploy their already confused assets. In the flagship, Vael'kor's attempts to regain control only highlighted the depth of the human strategy, reports of friendly fire, misaligned formations, and phantom threats created a cascading effect of uncertainty. Officers who had once relied on strict hierarchy and unchallenged directives now struggled to make decisions in an environment that had been carefully engineered to break their assumptions. In Earth's subterranean command centers, Admiral Carter coordinated follow-up strikes, monitoring sensor feedback to ensure that each disruption created further vulnerabilities, while Dr. Helen Brooks and her teams continued to inject software anomalies, not to destroy, but to manipulate, confuse, and misdirect, each action layered upon the last, creating a dynamic battlefield in which the Karthul could no longer rely on doctrine or training alone. On Luna, the final preparations for the deployment of experimental energy weapons reached completion, devices that could project phase pulses into enemy shield harmonics, causing temporary collapses that would allow concentrated human fire to penetrate even the heaviest armor. Technicians calibrated the pulses with precision down to the nanosecond, ensuring that they would align with both the timing of strikes and the ongoing disruptions to maximize damage, while minimizing risk to friendly vessels across the solar system. The coordinated timing of human forces created a rhythm that the Karthul could not predict, a constant variation in apparent positions, velocities, and threat vectors, forcing continuous reaction rather than decisive action in the midst of the chaos. Sirathal continued to monitor patterns that defied logic according to her training, movements that were at once deliberate and unpredictable, responses that exploited every opening without exposing vulnerability, and slowly, with growing alarm, she began to recognize that these were not the actions of an inferior species, but of a civilization that understood the principles of warfare in ways that the Coalition had dismissed. On Earth, Vice Admiral Hale observed the psychological effects spreading through the Karthul fleet, the initial overconfidence giving way to doubt, then fear, officers questioning each other, seeking confirmation that no one could provide, and in that void, human strategy pressed forward. Further attacks timed to coincide with moments of maximum hesitation, strike groups targeting fuel lines, communications arrays, and weapons platforms in rapid succession, creating a battlefield where every move by the Coalition carried risk and uncertainty. Dr. Brooks initiated the third phase of cyber operations, programs designed to appear as minor errors became active, subtly redirecting fire control systems to targets that were no threat or to empty space, causing misallocation of energy, wasted ammunition, and further eroding confidence, while simultaneously human reconnaissance units fed false intelligence into the enemy network, crafting the illusion of larger, more dispersed forces, each appearance calculated to reinforce a perception of overwhelming human capability. In the flagship, Vael'kor struggled to impose order. Every command met with delayed or conflicting responses, his once feared fleet now teetering on the brink of operational collapse. The systems and structures that made the Coalition dominant now magnified the impact of human ingenuity and timing. In the orbital shipyards, reinforcements prepared to engage, but the human strategy emphasized precision rather than brute force, focusing on multiplying the psychological effect of every strike and maintaining the initiative. Captain Mitchell directed his crews with quiet authority, each action synchronized to exploit confusion while remaining adaptable to unexpected reactions. Commander Reed's strike group executed further diversionary maneuvers, drawing Coalition ships away from vulnerable sectors, while human drones continued to create phantom contacts, each step deepening the sense of unpredictability and chaos. And as the hours passed, the Karthul began to realize that their assumptions had been fatally flawed, that what they had labeled weakness was in fact patience, cunning, and strategic brilliance, as human forces maintained their relentless, calculated pressure, demonstrating an understanding of war that went beyond simple numerical advantage. And in that unfolding hour, the Coalition confronted a terrifying truth. Humanity, underestimated, dismissed, and mocked, had prepared for this moment for decades, had studied every potential weakness, exploited every predictable behavior, and was now proving that Terran warfare was not only effective but terrifying in its precision, adaptability, and psychological impact, a revelation that would redefine how the galaxy understood the species it had once scorned. And as the human operations continued to unfold, the Karthul fleet's cohesion began to break down entirely. Sectors that had moved with careful synchronization now acted almost independently, with captains improvising to cover gaps or compensate for lost communication. Yet every independent action triggered further complications elsewhere in the fleet, the ripple effect magnifying the chaos in ways that Terran strategists had anticipated and planned for. Aboard the Resolute, Captain Aaron Mitchell observed as multiple enemy vessels misfired upon each other, defensive energy fields collapsing from experimental pulses projected by the Luna-based weapons, while human gunnery crews struck with unerring precision. Each shot timed to exploit the brief vulnerabilities in armor and shielding. Commander Jason Reed's strike group emerged again from stealth, appearing at multiple points almost simultaneously, launching coordinated strikes against remaining logistical and auxiliary units, further fracturing the enemy's operational capability. Dr. Helen Brooks' cybernetic operations had reached peak effect, targeting core command algorithms and causing misalignments in threat prioritization, in some cases causing the coalition warships to divert fire away from Terran forces or to overcompensate in maneuvers. The combined effect was not just physical destruction, but a psychological destabilization that left the Karthul officers second-guessing every decision. In the flagship, Supreme Strategist Vael'kor attempted to issue orders to re-establish command, yet every message was delayed, altered, or misinterpreted by the human-initiated interference. His once orderly fleet now resembled a chaotic swarm, with sectors acting at cross purposes, collisions narrowly avoided, and formations unraveling in a cascade of unintended consequences in orbital shipyards around Earth. Reinforcements were launched into precise positions, not for direct engagement but to consolidate human control of key vectors, acting as both shields and enablers for mobile strike units. The coordination required a level of timing and discipline that would have been impossible without decades of training in distributed command. On Mars, experimental energy pulse arrays were fired in carefully sequenced intervals, each pulse destabilizing multiple Karthul shields simultaneously, allowing human units to penetrate previously impervious defenses. The resultant shock waves further amplified the confusion, forcing the coalition to overcompensate, while Commander Reed's units exploited these openings to disable additional command vessels. Human strike coordinators monitored the impact in real time, adjusting subsequent waves to exploit every unexpected reaction. The psychological effect compounded as Karthul officers witnessed the unraveling of their strategy before any human vessel had even approached their main formations. Sirathal, observing these events, began to question every assumption about the humans, the apparent chaos now revealing itself as deliberate, precise, and deadly, and the realization spread through her consciousness that the species dismissed as weak had orchestrated a campaign of deception and precision that leveraged every advantage in patience, psychology, and technology across the solar system. Civilians glimpsed the extraordinary events via secure transmission, seeing flashes of light, distant explosions, and sudden movements that defied conventional understanding. The impact on morale was immediate, with many expressing awe at the humans' capability and resilience. The Karthul, who had intended to demonstrate dominance, now faced uncertainty on a scale they had never experienced. Vael'kor's confidence eroded with each report of misfires, misalignments, and friendly fire incidents. He realized that his fleet, built to demonstrate strength and enforce compliance, was instead being methodically dismantled by strategy, timing, and precision. In the hidden command centers on Earth, Admiral Carter and her staff monitored the cascading effects, coordinating follow-up actions that exploited the disarray, reinforcing pressure points, and ensuring that every Karthul misstep amplified human effectiveness. Dr. Brooks initiated tertiary cyber operations that subtly shifted enemy targeting priorities, creating phantom threats and redirecting energy outputs to non-critical systems. The effect multiplied as the coalition fleet scrambled to adapt, further degrading their operational capability. On Luna, new experimental weapon systems projected phased energy pulses designed to collapse overlapping shield harmonics across multiple vessels, enabling simultaneous concentrated strikes by human forces against previously untouchable assets. The coordination required split-second timing across vast distances, achieved through synchronized temporal pulses. And as the hours stretched on, the The Karthul command realized that every attempt to stabilize the fleet only exposed further vulnerabilities, each reaction creating openings that humans had anticipated and incorporated into their strategy. The outermost strike groups, under Commander Reed, targeted the remaining logistics hubs, cutting off fuel and supplies to the main body, while human deception drones created the illusion of additional fleets entering from unknown vectors, forcing the coalition to spread thin. The compounded effect was operational paralysis, confusion, and a rising sense of terror among officers who had expected submission and encountered instead a calculated display of overwhelming human ingenuity. On Earth, Vice Admiral Hale coordinated the final stages of Phase 2, ensuring that the timing of strikes, energy pulses, and cyber disruptions converged to create maximum effect just as coalition ships attempted to regroup. The result was a near-complete breakdown of fleet cohesion, leaving the Karthul vulnerable, disoriented, and exposed to the next phase of human action. And as the sun rose over Earth, casting light on a planet that had silently prepared for decades, the first decisive proof emerged that the species labeled weak had in fact orchestrated an intricate, devastating, and psychologically overwhelming campaign, demonstrating that Terran warfare was not measured by fleet size alone, but by preparation, precision, coordination, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy assumptions, a revelation that would forever change how the galaxy understood the underestimated power of humanity. And as the Karthul fleet struggled to recover from the cascading disruptions, human forces advanced into the third and decisive phase of their campaign, a synchronized assault designed to exploit every fracture in enemy cohesion and transform confusion into complete operational collapse. Strike groups deployed along previously concealed vectors, capitalizing on gaps created by disrupted logistics, misfired weapons, and compromised communication links, while orbital batteries and experimental weapon systems unleashed phased energy pulses that pierced previously impenetrable shields, the timing so precise that multiple vessels across the fleet were simultaneously rendered vulnerable. On the Resolute, Captain Aaron Mitchell coordinated with multiple task groups, each maneuver calculated to exploit openings as they appeared, while retaining flexibility to adapt to unpredicted Karthul reactions. Commander Jason Reed's unit struck critical supply nodes, simultaneously engaging auxiliary vessels and command hubs, creating a ripple effect of damage that propagated through the enemy fleet. In the flagship, Vael'kor's attempts to issue coherent orders were continually thwarted by human cyber operations, programs that injected contradictory data, rerouted targeting systems, and created phantom threats, causing misallocations of firepower, confusion in fleet movements, and the first instances of panic among senior officers. On Mars, orbital facilities monitor the engagement, adjusting human deployments in real time, reinforcing successful strikes, exploiting emergent vulnerabilities, while human gunnery crews fire with exacting precision, exploiting the temporary collapses of shields and armor created by coordinated energy pulses. In Luna-based control centers, Dr. Helen Brooks and her teams continued layered cyber assaults, redirecting Karthul targeting priorities, generating false command feedback, and amplifying confusion in ways that compounded the effects of physical strikes. The coalition, previously confident in its numerical and technological superiority, now faced a force that controlled not only the physical battlefield, but the perceptual and cognitive space of their commanders. Sirathal, observing the relentless human assault, could no longer deny the depth of Terran's strategic acumen, noting the deliberate coordination, psychological manipulation, and precise exploitation of enemy expectations, realizing that the species her people had, dismissed as weak, had orchestrated a campaign that anticipated, countered, and amplified the limitations of the coalition's rigid doctrines across the inner system. Civilian observers saw flashes, explosions, and rapid movements that defied comprehension, the scale and precision of the conflict revealing a level of discipline, preparation, and technological integration far beyond prior understanding. The human strike forces continue to isolate and neutralize key Karthul command elements, severing lines of communication and creating bottlenecks in fleet coordination, each failure further amplifying the effectiveness of subsequent attacks. On the ground, Admiral Carter monitored the engagement with meticulous attention, timing follow-on strikes and cyber interventions to exploit every emerging weakness, ensuring that the momentum remained firmly with human forces. Vice Admiral Hale coordinated reserves to cover critical positions, ready to reinforce or exploit as the situation evolved. And as the Karthul tried to adapt, they found that every assumption they relied on, their experience, discipline, technological superiority, and expectation predictable enemy behavior, had been turned against them. In the flagship, Vael'kor's composure unraveled as reports of repeated friendly fire, failed maneuvers, and compromised communications reached his console. The fleet he had intended to demonstrate absolute dominance, now teetering on the brink of collapse. He attempted to restore order, issuing commands that were ignored, misinterpreted, or overridden by cascading effect of human interventions. The once feared coalition warships, now vulnerable, disoriented, and ineffective against a coordinated human onslaught. In the outer sectors, strike groups under Commander Reed executed rapid redeployments, exploiting gaps in Karthul formations, disabling remaining supply chains, and creating the perception of even greater human numbers through deception drones and false sensor signatures. Every move carefully orchestrated to maximize operational and psychological impact. In Earth orbit, experimental energy systems continue to destabilize enemy shields in synchrony with human attacks, allowing concentrated fire to penetrate the heaviest vessels, while cyber operations manipulated fleet targeting priorities, drawing enemy fire to empty space and further disorienting crews. Across Mars and Luna, additional human units reinforced the pressure striking from unexpected vectors, ensuring that the coalition's attempts to recover only deepened their disarray. Sirathal, witnessing the relentless precision and adaptive strategy of the Terrans, finally understood that the species had turned every historical weakness into a weapon, patience into power, and perceived disorganization into a carefully orchestrated campaign of overwhelming effect. And as hours passed, the coalition fleet, previously assumed invincible, found itself shattered, paralyzed, and demoralized, with the humans having demonstrated not only technological and tactical mastery, but the terrifying reality that a species underestimated could wield strategy, coordination, psychological insight, and precision on a scale that made the most dominant galactic power appear vulnerable. On Earth, the human leadership watched as the first comprehensive victory unfolded, the culmination of decades of preparation, study, and disciplined execution, the first visible proof that humanity, dismissed as weak and inconsequential, had orchestrated a demonstration of capability that would forever redefine its position in the galaxy. And as the final strike waves completed their tasks, the Karthul, once confident, now confronted the unthinkable truth. Humanity, underestimated, mocked, and threatened, was a force of unparalleled strategic brilliance, a species whose patience, ingenuity, and ruthless exploitation of enemy assumptions had turned apparent weakness into absolute power, a revelation that would echo across star systems for generations and mark the turning point where Terran warfare had become both feared and respected across the galaxy. And as the remnants of the coalition fleet staggered under the weight of human strategy, the full scope of Terran planning became apparent. A tapestry of coordinated strikes, cyber manipulation, experimental weapon deployment, and psychological warfare that left no element of Karthul command or control intact. The outermost sectors, once considered secure and invulnerable, now isolated and disoriented, the main body of the fleet rendered ineffective as navigation, targeting, and communication. Systems failed one after another. On the Resolute, Captain Aaron Mitchell coordinated mop-up operations, sending units to intercept stragglers, secure critical points, and ensure that no element of the enemy fleet could regroup, while simultaneously maintaining the illusion of overwhelming human numbers through continued deployment of drones and false sensor signatures. Commander Jason Reed's strike teams penetrated deep into the remaining command nodes, disabling final coordination arrays, and further fracturing morale among coalition officers. Sirathal, witnessing the collapse of the fleet she had once regarded as unassailable, struggled to reconcile the stark contrast between expectation and reality, recognizing that human forces had anticipated every predictable reaction, every assumption of superiority, and had turned them into liabilities. Dr. Helen Brooks' cyber operations finalized the last phase of infiltration, temporarily taking control of remaining targeting systems, redirecting defensive fire to non-critical locations, and creating control chaos that ensured no coalition ship could mount an organized counterattack. Across Mars and Luna, orbital batteries and energy pulse arrays continued precise engagements, neutralizing residual threats and reinforcing human control of strategic vectors. In the flagship, Vael'kor realized that his entire campaign had been outmaneuvered, the pride of the coalition shattered, the fleet's capabilities neutralized, and the very concept of dominance called into question. Across Earth, leaders and civilians observed the aftermath, a spectacle of precision, coordination, and tactical brilliance that transformed what had begun as a threat into an unmistakable demonstration of human power. Admiral Carter coordinated final consolidation control over the battlefield, ensuring that every human unit was positioned to maintain advantage and prevent any resurgence, while Vice Admiral Hale oversaw the reinforcement of critical supply lines and strategic positions, ensuring sustainability and readiness for any follow-on actions. The Karthul officers, their confidence shattered, faced the consequences of underestimating a species they believed weak, the psychological impact profound, as they processed the meticulous efficiency, adaptability, and intelligence behind every Terran maneuver. Across the system, human forces established dominance without resorting to indiscriminate destruction, leveraging precision, patience, and strategy to maximize effect while minimizing unnecessary loss. In command centers, Admiral Carter and her staff reflected on the campaign, aware that humanity had not only survived the threat, but had demonstrated capabilities and strategic foresight that ensured lasting respect across the galaxy. Sirathal, returning from observation posts, carried the grim realization back to her people that humans could not be dismissed or underestimated, that their restraint, patience, and cunning were matched only by their capacity for decisive, overwhelming action when necessary. And as the coalition forces retreated, disoriented, defeated, and demoralized, the galaxy began to comprehend the true nature of Terran warfare, a system of thought, planning, and execution that transformed perceived weakness into strategic dominance, that patience became power, and that a species once ridiculed and underestimated could shape the course of galactic history. In the quiet that followed, human forces consolidated control over critical sectors, repaired damaged systems, and established new protocols to monitor remaining enemy assets, ensuring that no future threat could exploit gaps revealed during engagement. While on Earth, celebrations were tempered by the solemn understanding of the stakes, that humanity's survival and success were earned through meticulous preparation, strategic brilliance, and relentless discipline. And as the Karthul returned to their home systems to report the disaster, their leaders confronted the irreversible truth that they had misjudged humanity at their peril, that the species they had called weak had demonstrated mastery of strategy, coordination, psychological manipulation, and technological integration on a scale that left an entire empire paralyzed, that every assumption of superiority had been exploited, and that the galaxy would never again consider Earth a minor player, that Terran warfare, long underestimated, had revealed itself as a terrifying and brilliant force, one that ensured humanity's place among the dominant civilizations, a revelation that would echo across star systems for generations, forever altering the balance of power, respect, and caution in interstellar relations. And as the human fleets returned to secure positions, systems stabilized, and command networks re-established, the galaxy finally understood that underestimating Earth was the gravest error a civilization could make, and that the species once dismissed as weak had proven beyond doubt that humanity's ingenuity, resilience, and strategic brilliance were forces that no empire could afford to ignore, marking the end of the campaign, the decisive demonstration of Terran power, and the terrifying truth about Terran warfare that would forever be remembered as the moment when humanity declared, with unshakable clarity, that weakness had never been their nature.